Okay, good morning.
Good morning, Gary.
My name's Gary Matsuoka, and we're here at Laguna Hills Nursery Saturday morning. And today's class is one of our favorites on avocados. So we consider avocados now one of our specialties, especially since we are not allowed to sell citrus in this region at the moment. So, and avocados on top of that are probably the healthiest fruit that you can grow. All other fruits have significant amounts of sugar. That's the reason we eat them. Avocados, very, very little sugar in them. Just healthy fats. So generally, if you eat avocados, you won't get fat unless you get the West Indian types, which have more carbohydrates and less fat. So the avocados originally came from, they think they all evolved in southern Mexico. And if you've ever been to southern Mexico in the winter, it's pretty much 90 degrees in the daytime, you know. So, I mean, they do drop into the 70s and 60s now and then, but they're at the very edge, I guess, of the subtropical region, or the, right between tropics and subtropics there. So they really like it warm. They're not real happy with our winters here, but they'll tolerate them pretty well because they do get some of that weather down in southern Mexico now and then. Apparently they were moved all around Central and South America and the West Indies for thousands of years. People have been growing them in those regions. But generally, Mexico is where they think they evolved, but there are three distinct races that they consider. One is called the Guatemalan, and then that's the most cold sensitive variety. And then there's the Mexicans, which are a little bit hardier to cold, and then the West Indies, which we don't grow at all. They like tropical conditions there. So most of the ones we sell are hybrids. They've got some mostly Mexicans, some Guatemalans. There's a few that are totally Guatemalan, and we'll mention those too. Now, growing these, now we're pretty much specialists in growing them in pots. We know how to grow them in containers. I don't have an orchard of avocados that I'm growing, so I can't tell you that I'm an expert in the ground. However, one of our friends, and I walk through the orchard virtually every day. In fact, yesterday I was there 3 times walking through the orchard. And they've got about a couple dozen avocados mixed in with a couple hundred citrus trees, and they're on solid clay, and it's totally muck in the wintertime, and their trees look fine. So we know that drainage can be overrated. So the problem with avocados primarily is that you buy an avocado tree from someone else, you put it in the ground, it doesn't grow real fast. It sits there for a while and slowly declines, and after about 4 or 5 years you give up on it and say avocados are just not worth growing. So the problem has been is that what they're telling you is that you're overwatering or that your drainage is poor, but this avocado has no drainage. So drainage really isn't the key. This is just sitting in water. It's been sitting in water for several months now. It's growing. It looks quite happy. And it can probably be in here for another year or 2 before it outgrows this little glass of water. So drainage is not critical. However, the amount of water, oxygen in the water is critical. So if you've got water and there's no oxygen in it, your tree's in trouble. Just like fish, if there's no oxygen in the water, the fish die. So avocados can breathe in water, the roots can breathe in water as long as there's adequate oxygen. Now, according to the water district, legally they have to make sure that our tap water has 5 to 7 parts per million oxygen, so that when you water your plants or you add water to a fish tank or to your pond, it doesn't kill everything. It's got to have that much oxygen in it, 5 to 7 parts per million, in order to keep the roots of your plants alive and your fish alive and other animals that live in water alive. Well, the main thing that'll take the oxygen out of the water is compost. So you've got ground up dead things mixed with the water. They're using the oxygen really quickly, and if they don't have enough oxygen to decompose properly, then they start creating sewer gases, which just start wiping out everything. And if you have low oxygen levels, root rot diseases are highly promoted by that. I'm going to need some help bring more chairs out. Move the displays back, put more chairs. Okay, so the main thing is most avocados that you buy, they're growing them in compost, either 75% or, I would say somewhere between 40 to 75% compost. Well, I know one grower who grows them 100%. So those plants are likely to rot and die within a few years. So compost can work. Doing a little rearranging here. So compost can work for temporary, because when it's fresh and it's chunky and flaky, the air can get through. The oxygen can get in there and replace the oxygen that's being used by the decomposition of the compost. Well, eventually, with compost, the pieces get smaller and smaller as they decompose. They no longer can bring air into that area, so that the oxygen that is being used to decompose the compost is no longer replaced, and then that's when you get the root rot. So it can happen, 3 or 4 months down the road. It can happen a year down the road. Depends what kind of compost the grower is using. We know one grower uses coconut coir 100%, and we know coconut coir in about a year and a half looks terrible. It holds up for quite a while, but eventually it loses all its, we call it permeability, ability to breathe oxygen or breathe air, to let the gas exchanges, and that's when you start getting the root rot going on. So you get root rot on avocados that you buy from other growers. They blame you for overwatering it or not having the best drainage. But in this orchard I look at, it's really bad conditions. And what I've told them in the past is that whenever you buy a fruit tree from anybody, bare root it before you plant it in the ground. Get all that compost off it, and they follow what I've been telling them, and their trees look great. So,
How do you do that?
well, there's different methods. Now with avocados, what I've been doing is getting the root ball out, laying it on the ground on its side, and taking a chopstick and carefully picking off the soil between the roots. Try not to break too many roots. I mean, if you break 10% of the roots, not a big deal. But if you start breaking off half the root system, you can be in trouble. So, and just so you know, when we do that operation, we always like to shade the plants we do it to for 2 weeks for half the day, which can be as simple as, if they're a short plant, putting a tall object next to them, or a canopy over them. Sunlight gets in morning, afternoon, but not midday. Something like that for 2 weeks to get over that shock period, because it takes 2 weeks for roots to recover from any operation you do on them. But we do that a lot with other people's trees and plants.
Somewhere I read or heard that avocado, transplanting avocados is very sensitive to disturbance.
We find that too. I mean, when we got trees from a grower that's growing 100% coconut coir, we said, okay, we got to take this off. It's just 100%. So we did that operation on them and lost half of them. They didn't die all of a sudden. Over the period of the next half a year, we were losing them. So we said, okay, we don't want to sell these, and we want to see how this operation's going on, and we lost half of them that we did that to, so that we don't consider that an easy plant to do. It's possible, but unless you're really good at it, it may not work at all.
You said chopsticks. I know you use water too occasionally on other plants.
So a strong stream of water is the most gentle way to remove soil from roots. We got used to doing it with chopsticks because of the drought. We didn't want to use all that water, because when we did it I started doing this back in the 90s, We would sit there with the hose and blast away, and you have this little river running by you. So that's what the literature says. A stream of water is. Now, I don't like to use buckets only because to capture the water, only because if one plant has root rot and you wash the soil off into the bucket, then you just transfer it to every plant you're doing. So I would just put them over if at your house, I would just put over an area that can handle the water, like a lawn or a rose bed, somewhere where you need the water. So, okay, so we don't like to do that anymore. We'd rather. So now what we do is we buy the trees when they look like this. So we got in 1,500 of these back in March. No, it's February. And we potted them up in February. And these two trees here are some of the ones we potted up. We didn't do it in February. We usually put the dates on there. This one was done March 20th. Forgot to write the date on that one. I think we did these a month later in April. The Sharwells we got in late. So they graft. So the way these things are grown, you can see a avocado seed right there. So they start, this is a Zutano pit. So what they do is they grow these Zutano pits in these bags. And about 3 months after they start them, so this is this a little bigger, they cut off the top and graft them. So underneath this grafting tape is where they grafted them. On these, the tape already is falling off. And you can see a graft right here where they cut the original seed plant of the Zutano seed off. This year. So they, you get them into some more room and they just take off and grow. Now, these aren't the biggest ones. I mean, we have some that are over 6 foot. And now these two trees here are ones that were like this last year. So last year we started these. They grew up to about 5 foot by the end of this year, and they fruited. Yeah. You can see the fruit on that. Maybe 100 fruit on that tree. It's got a lot. And this tree grew even taller. This is one of the tallest trees from last year's crop, and it has about a half dozen fruit on it. So we're quite pleased that we expect all these to fruit next year. We do. We expect them to fruit next year. Now, some of them we notice, the ones that grew the quickest. We have some from last year that are over 7 foot. They didn't fruit. Apparently, they used all their energy to grow instead. So it seems like the ones in the middle that grew but didn't grow excessively fruit better. We have a few, and I didn't bring one in, but we have one from last year that's this tall. That's about less than 2 foot tall. It looks healthy. It's got fruit on it, but it didn't grow. So that's the problem when you use Zutano seed, is that even though these are all seeds from a Zutano tree, every seed is genetically different, and you never know what's going to happen. We had, from last year, we had maybe 4 or 5 that I'm not selling because they don't look right. And then that one looks great. It just didn't grow at all. It just made big leaves, flowered, it's got fruit on it, but it's not growing. So we think that's something to do with the pit because the tops are genetically identical. Yes.
So would you top them at like 6, 7 feet?
Well, most of these trees, when they get over the top of the stake, they just do this. Especially if they're fruiting, you may not have to top them. I mean, a lot of these varieties we'll talk about are considered dwarf because they naturally don't grow big, unless right, containers do cause them to be smaller also. So.
Gary, these 2 large trees you have here, did they go straight to the little 1 gallon or the
No.
sweet
No, we always put them in 5s first because we don't want to put one of these in a big one and it never grows. Because again, about, what was that for us? Maybe 2% of them didn't grow. So we don't want to see that happen either in that big pot or in the ground either. We'd rather see them grow in these 5-gallon or, 5-gallon pots are really 3.5 gallons. Rather waste the time in there than in the bigger pots. Plus, when we get these in February, the ground's really cold and big pots are colder. The small pots like this, you get them out in the sun, they're warm, they're hot. So that's the other thing. We put them in these. We take them to our growing ground, put them on the west side of a block wall on black plastic next to a gravel driveway. So it is hot. It is the hottest place we can think of, west side of a block wall. Now, this is last week with the 90-degree weather. Some of the leaves right against the wall started shriveling a bit. Some of the new growth started to shrivel a little bit right against the wall, so I pulled them about 2 feet off the wall to get them off there. So.
Is there anything wrong with putting it in a large pot to start with the sweet drifting so much?
No, it's just going to be a little slower growing, just from the temperatures alone. So. Yeah, we went from 5-gallon. So we have the dates on there when we went to the 15-gallon. That was done last August. And this was done, I don't know, I don't see the date on this side. It says the same day, August 3rd. So we transferred those to 15 gallons. Now we did transfer one of these to a 24-inch box in January. So by October, they were actually ready to go in the ground. They were well rooted. The trunks were already over an inch thick. And we put one in a box in January, but I didn't want to haul that box in here. Yeah, so these will probably sell later. I don't know if I'll sell them right now or anything. This is the lamb, also known as lamb house, and this is Pinkerton. Okay, so now we got in 100 of these reeds from Brokaw. Brokaw does these little guys for us. Next year they'll let us do close to 2,000 of them. I think a lot of growers are not ordering them as much because we had a limit a few years ago. We could only order 1,200. This year they said our limit is, there's no limit. So I think they're losing customers who try to grow them and fail because of their mix. I know one of our customers are suppliers that buys from Brokaw, because we see the same varieties of avocados that they do, but they use 75% sawdust. And I don't know that they've had as good success as we've had. So Brokaw is giving us more leeway to place a lot of orders of those liners. Now this is one of Brokaw's trees. This is what they sell to orchards. This is on clonal roots. So the difference is, well, they start in the same way. So this is 2 years. So they start with the seed and they graft on a special avocado that makes good roots. Now, the way they find these avocados with good roots, they go to orchards where a lot of root rot has occurred in the past and trees have died, and then there's one tree that's just surviving in the muck and in the mess. And they go, okay, that tree, the roots on that tree, which are grown from seed, are genetically superior. So they induce it to make suckers, and they start using those suckers to graft, and they call that particular tree, in this case, the tree's called Duke 7. That tree is considered to have superior roots. So what they do is, when this is ready to be grafted, they graft Duke 7 onto it. They grow it in a greenhouse for a while, and then they darken the greenhouse so this branch thinks it's in the ground. And then they sink it deeper, the whole thing deeper into this larger pot, and keep it real dark in there. And they also put a little brass ring right above the graft to cut it off. So eventually it just self-cuts off. And what that does, it forces this to root or else it dies. So that's in this soil, it roots out, it's got the superior roots, and then when that thing gets big enough, they graft this on top of it. These are grafted late last year to the second top, so they're grafted twice. So we've taken these apart before, and there's the seed at the very bottom with dead roots on it, and then above it the living roots of the clonal rootstock, and then this tree on top of that. So that's how most, they said about 60% of all the orchard trees are now using clonal roots. The problem with seedling roots, again, is that you have to go through your orchard in a couple of years and pull out maybe 2 to 5% of them that aren't growing the way the rest of the orchard is, from the because of the variations in the seeds. I mean, some will, again, a few will be more vigorous than the rest and not produce as well. Some will be dwarf. So in order to prevent that, they clone the roots so that each tree is genetically identical. They've identified Duke 7 as being one of the best production rootstocks known. Not necessarily the best against root disease, but certainly one of the best, not bad, not susceptible to root disease like some seedlings would be, but not, entirely root rot resistant. So these cost a bit more. We sell these for $89. These are $69, and that's the extra cost that we get charged for this. Now these aren't in perfect soil. When we first met Brokaw 25 years ago, they did not appear that they had organic matter in here, but they work alongside University of California, and they've been told over and over, I guess, to add sawdust to their mix. So I think the root rot resistance of this rootstock is kind of balanced out by the poor soil. I haven't had the nerve to talk to Brokaw about this yet, but I think I'll do it this year because it seems to be getting worse and worse. And they have mentioned to me they've had some crop failures, or they seem to have crop failures. I mean, I get hints from them that some of their crops aren't right, and I think we know why. So, and I don't think they know why. So I'll be talking to them hopefully soon. We'll see if we can resolve the problems with. But Brokaw and my family started the business at almost the same time, so hopefully it'll give them. I'll have some authority here, and not just a newbie trying to tell them that they're doing stuff wrong. Yes.
So if I plant the wheat avocado in the backyard, does it need full sun, or can you really slowly from the pepper tree that's over there?
Well, avocados, in nature, they grow up in jungles. They can handle the darkness, but they don't produce as well. So, you can grow avocados inside your house, like this one, but they may not produce much inside. They don't have the energy. So the more sun you get on them, the better. So now, we have technology today. You can have LED lights and everything. Get a good crop in there.
So like during these hot weather, do they need to be shaded at least for the first year?
Okay, so they're from southern Mexico. And what we've seen, we've had some heat waves over the last few years. What we notice is avocados seem to grow the very fastest between 90 and 110. They seem to like that weather. If they're healthy, they grow like weeds. If it gets much above 110, what we noticed, so what was it, 4 years ago, we had that 115-degree weather? All the new growth shriveled up on those 2 days. The mature leaves weren't touched. All the new growth shriveled up, but boy, that summer stayed hot, and they grew back so fast. I mean, that year we had some monster avocado trees because they love to be right around 100 degrees. If they're healthy, they can handle it. Now, going back into the 80s when I didn't buy trees from Brokaw. I bought them from the other growers in the area that sell to all the other stores. And we noticed that their branches exposed to the sunlight, it's not the leaves that burn, it's the branches, they would burn at about 90.
That's when they go dark brown.
Yeah, they turn black, turn brown. Brokaws did not burn until we never saw Brokaws burn until, was it 2010, hit 112. That's the first time we ever saw a Brokaw tree burn. Now we do notice that if you got a hot day early in the year or late in the year, it's nasty on the avocados. So in summertime, the sun's coming pretty much the hot part of the day is straight down on them. Doesn't hit much but the leaves. But late September, we get a heat wave. Sun's coming like this. This gets and that last year, that April heat wave, didn't hurt any of the young trees, but we had some older trees that the sun just got the trunks. And we didn't know that was going to happen. We hit 103 in April last year. They weren't ready for that. So we lost one tree entirely because it just burnt the bottom of the trunk. And we weren't expecting that to happen. But then all the new guys that were real vigorous, no damage from that one. Yes?
I had trouble with Fuerte. I've heard other growers. Do you have any experience with the Fuerte?
We'll go over the varieties. Yeah, we don't ever promote Fuertes. So anyway, so when you plant them, drainage is not super important, but all the conditions you make when you improve drainage help it grow faster. So if you want to put it in a raised area of your garden, like in my backyard, I put my avocado in a big mound in the backyard. It was actually where we had pulled out a huge melaleuca tree with a trunk this big, and when they ground the stump, it left essentially a wood bowl in the ground because it was just almost solid root beyond the area where they excavated it. So I just filled that thing up with sand, a few bags of our top pot, but I just went and bought 30 bags of sand, just the cheapest sand they had at the big box store, and put a boxed avocado I was growing in my backyard into the hole, fill it around with sand, and now it's about 2 or 3 times the volume from it was last summer when we did that. So it's done quite well. I'm really scared though that wood bowl is going to cause some trouble eventually. So far it looks good and it's growing well. So anything you do to make the soil more airy by raising it up, the raised planters, great. Get it above, just to make sure it's not the lowest part of your yard where it's a pond in the middle of winter. That's the main thing. If it's not that, you should be okay. Yes?
Growing on a slope seems to work.
Well, most orchards are on slopes because, the drainage. I mean, the avocado belt in California is these hills behind us all the way down to Mexico. So they like the hills. You go down to Vista or Temecula, it's all those hills. All the sides are covered with avocado trees, so they have the good drainage. So even if they come in kind of a composty soil, if that drainage is really good, they'll probably do fine with it. But if not, so if you want to make sure, now what I do when I transplant these in the bigger pots or when you put them in the ground is I'll get the chopsticks out and pry off maybe half the soil that's got the most compost. They don't seem to mix the soil with the compost really well. Some parts of it are almost pure on the side. You just take that part off. The roots are not growing in it anyway. They're growing in the heavier soil in there. So you can pry some of that off to get it out of there. Peel the top layer off. A lot of the compost floats to the top of the container. So a lot of that on top is not important to keep around. There's no roots in that either.
Do they like I'm sure you're talking, but do they like a compost or mulch topping?
Deep layer leaves. The nature, the leaves just lay there. One of my friends went down to Guatemala, and he told me that they dug through 5 foot of dead leaves underneath the wild avocado tree. So that's really deep. So in containers, if you grow them in pots, we use our top pot, which is not sand, it's not the ideal soil. If this was a bag of sand, I couldn't lift it. It'd be over 100 pounds. So we made our top pot out of things that work like sand, but are lighter. So there is 10% sand here. There's 20% perlite. There's 30% pumice. Those are all same thing as sand, quartz. So this is essentially 65% quartz. There's 35% peat, 60% quartz. Well, anyway, I know there's 5% charcoal in here too. So charcoal is the only organic matter that recently died, but in the form of when it's charcoal, it's inert. It doesn't decompose. Peat moss, we like it because it's light and it holds water. It's been sitting at the bottom of a lake in Canada for thousands of years. It's got very little reaction when it's in water. It doesn't make the water go septic on you. So it still decomposes, but at a very slow rate. I mean, ground up wood is really fast. It decomposes really. I mean, what we keep trying to explain to people is that in nature, trees don't grind themselves up into millions of pieces when they die. They decompose very slowly in a solid mass, but we can't figure out why anyone think that ground up wood or ground up bark in potting soil is anything close to being natural. It's just totally artificial environment, just a ground up dead tree that's been allowed to decompose for a few months. And so you're putting all this bacteria and fungus into your pots and trying to grow plants in it, and they all rot and die. So anyway, so we're trying to fix it. So that's what we use in pots. 24-inch box like this. If you have a container this big, you'll need about 3.5 bags to go around it, maybe 4. Pot that big, maybe 2.5. This kind of pot, 15 gallon, takes 1.5 bags of top pot. You can go pure sand, just harder to move. Now the nice thing about sand, if you load this with sand, it's not going to blow over in the wind.
Or any other.
Yeah. So.
Gary, what size pot can permanently feed avocado trees? What's the ultimate size you want to get to?
Well, I had a friend who had an avocado tree in a box for about 5 or 6 years. It was a reed avocado. He had 80 fruit on that thing. That's pretty darn good. So he gets bored easy, so he gave it away after that. But if you can grow 80 avocados in a 24-inch box, that's worth it. So up until that time, we never thought that avocados would produce heavily enough to make it worthwhile to grow in a pot, because we figure a Hass tree, if a full-size Hass only makes 100 fruit a year, you got this thing that's maybe 1/10 the size of a Hass. It's like, why even grow in a pot? You're only going to get a few fruit. You're not going to get that much. But once we saw 80 fruit on this tree in a 24-inch box, we're going, okay, that's pretty impressive. That's like almost like any other fruit tree. Right.
Yeah, but those boxes aren't going to last forever.
True.
25 or 50 gallon cans.
Well, yeah, black plastic pots will last at least 10 years. These last about 5 years. It's like all these pieces to hold together start failing. So, and then the bottom of the box generally starts rotting away first. So yeah, I mean, they have diagrams on the internet where you can make wood boxes with replaceable sides. So.
Is that 24?
This is a 24. If it was a cube, it'd hold 8 cubic feet, but as a beveled thing, it only holds 4.5, maybe 5 at the max. So it's not a true 8 cubic foot of soil there. Okay, so in the ground, generally, if you buy one from us and your soil is not the worst soil you've ever seen, you just put in a hole in the ground and put. It is always nice when you first install things, especially in the summer. So here's the tree. the root ball we give you, just leave it alone, don't mess with it. And then put the dirt you took out of the hole, make a nice watering basin. Yeah, caldera.
Okay.
So that when you water it, the water doesn't go over here, it goes right through here. For the next few weeks until the roots get out into the surrounding soil, it's critical that they get watered right here. If you don't have that berm there, now if you have a drip system and it just drips on it, you're good. But if you use the hose and there's no berm, it's going to be dry in a few days. There's no way that the water will sit there long enough to soak in. It's got to sit there for like 30, 40 seconds to go through this root ball. If we grew these in real dirt, it would take a few hours for that water to soak in. But our soil is highly porous to the water.
Do you recommend that method of planting in grounding in the hole versus the 18-inch balance method? Because I've seen that with Growcott illustration.
Right, they recommend making a 2-foot berm or 18-inch berm and planting the trees on that. I think that's because they're having a lot of problems with growers getting root rot with that soil. Yeah, we think drainage is way overrated, and it's due to other things. It's not a water drainage issue. So
So to help the root ball extend, isn't a 50-50 mix of top pot and your native soil around the root ball?
no, not necessarily better.
Okay.
Yeah, the most important thing to make the roots want to grow out is to make sure that when this is established, you knock that berm down, make it wider, or water a bigger area, and keep that whole area moist, because the roots generally follow the water supply. I mean, I had a tree once that I had 3 drippers on it, and I dug it up after 10 years, and the only roots I found were balls of roots underneath each dripper. There's no roots anywhere else. They formed right where I had watered it. So you expand the watering area out. Now, most avocados, like the orchard I walk through, they've got micro sprinklers which shoot out the water about 10 foot. So underneath the tree, about 10 foot this way and 10 foot this way. Well, they have 2 micro sprinklers that are maybe 2 foot apart. So they're doing maybe about 12 foot across an area underneath the trees. And you can see, because it's clay, the water absorbs out a little further, so it stays wet just outside the drip line of the trees. So ample water. We figure avocado trees on a day like today would use, if it's a 15-foot avocado, I don't expect you to grow them that big anymore. Say a 15-foot high and wide tree, if it's 90 degrees, trees tend to use about 50 gallons a day. So now we're close to the coast, so figure 30. They said in Riverside, when they did the testing, 50 gallons a day, 90-degree day. Here we're more humid, so maybe around 30, 35 gallons per day. Now, the only way you can ever check the moisture ground, so avocado roots aren't that deep. Of course, not many plants go below a foot deep anyway. I haven't really seen it. I've dug a lot of trees out in my life and not seen roots much deeper than a foot in any case, trees this big. You get a stick about the same thickness of this wood stake on here, piece of rebar would work, and see how far you can push it in where you're watering the soil. If you can push in 12 to 18 inches, it's plenty moist. If you can push it in 3 feet, you're wasting water.
A tree this size would need not 30, but
Oh, that might use a gallon a day at that size. So I know on Brokaw's website, when they're planting trees like this, they said maybe a gallon every day or every 2 days. I know they're changing their website around because I think they're seeing a lot of root rot in orchards. So they're saying now let it get dry between watering, but we never do that. I mean, these trees we watered almost every day. Even some days it rained, and we just kept the root ball looking soggy, and they've been real happy with it. It's not like it dries out in Guatemala at all. Yes. you can injure some roots. But, you know, you see, you can push it down, say, a few inches outside the root ball and check that soil right there. So if you can push it down again about a foot and a half, you're perfect. 8 inches is no-go, that you need more water. So.
How do you tell that in a pot?
Well, in a container, if the top of the soil looks wet, it's still wet all the way to the bottom. Once the top looks dry, go ahead and water it. You can't overwater it. I mean, yeah, you can't overwater avocado trees. So, because we notice that our growing ground, the trees in the front that are right off the gravel, they always dry out first. The ones in the middle don't dry out so much. The ones in the back against the hot wall dry out faster too. We just water them all the same. So the ones in the middle never dry out. The ones in the front and back is ones we're really worried about. But we just water them all the same. They're fine. Yes?
So when you plant in the ground, fill out fertilizer.
Okay. So the goal the first year is to make as much foliage as you can. So you just fertilize and fertilize and fertilize according to what the bag says. Now, we always use the Osmocote because we don't have the time to go out there and fertilize as much as we'd like. So this lasts 6 months. In the long run, organic fertilizers like these are generally better. Now we're pruning this one because the price on this one's getting a bit high. We're not sure if we're going to restock them or not because they're really high this year. So anyway, this one's really good. And so just make sure they're well fed. In a container, this one you'd have to apply every month if you're going to keep them well fed. This one every 6 months, but we do both. When we initially plant this into these containers, we put in an ounce of this and an ounce of that to keep them going up until the time we sell them. They don't show any signs of letting up. So the first year, all you want to do is make them dark green, real bushy, get them growing. Now these two, we wanted to see them fruit. So they say when you want them to fruit, you starve them. Because so fertilizer, this is not food. This is not food in the sense that it makes anything stronger. This is a building material. So these are all building materials. The plant gets its energy from the sunlight. The slower it's growing, the more energy it has stored up. The faster it's growing, it's using the energy from the sunlight to make those new leaves. You don't have much energy left. So in order to get them to fruit better, they say starve them from November or December through May. Don't feed them if you want them to flower and fruit well. So all the energy that they're capturing is going into setting that fruit. Then once you get past the setting period, then you fertilize them. Now, normally it's June when you fertilize. This year, everything was delayed a month, so we just started fertilizing these now to get them back to green. But this one set really well. I mean, we're amazed how much fruit is on this. That's only 1 year past. It's a year and a half past being grafted. So that's a lamb. And again, we expected a little more on this one, but we didn't see it bloom as heavily. Some of these avocados within 1 year, they're blooming like they're blooming like crazy. So,
Fertilize every month.
well, once avocados start production, you don't fertilize them much. If you leave their dead leaves underneath them, that's pretty much mostly what they need. You can take a look now and then and see the leaf color and see if you need anything, but generally, once they're in production size, if this is all you want to grow, that's fine. Just leave the dead leaves underneath it. You're pretty good that way. If a tree's starving, it's not like it's dying. It just won't grow. Now they do need to replace their leaves constantly. So avocado leaves don't seem to live that long. Some trees seem to replace them every 6 months. As they put a new set on, the old set turns yellow, falls off. So don't be alarmed. This tree has hung on to most of its baby leaves but some of my trees don't have any leaves for the bottom 2 foot of their trunk. They've already dropped them. So, so they're keeping about 6 months of foliage on them. So they can, I mean, Brokaw told me that some of their varieties of avocados, like Carmen, they call them the deciduous avocado tree because every time they're ready to put a new growth on, all the old leaves just fall off. And it's real scary, they say, but they're learning to get used to that on some of their avocado trees. So,
How does leaf color tell you about the
well, if it's dark green, it's got nitrogen. One of the things that shows you it's lacking nitrogen is the center vein of the leaf is very pale. You see the center vein of this leaf is paler than the rest of the leaf, whereas on this one it's not as noticeable. Especially on some of these leaves, you don't notice the center vein being pale. But on this one too, you can see the center vein's a bit pale. So that means there's not as much nitrogen as we would need to make the new leaves. So again, we fertilized. I only fertilized that like 3 days ago. So it hasn't responded quite yet. Okay, so fertilizer-wise, now there's no set rule on how much fertilizer to give avocados. You just kind of watch it and go. I mean, it's really hard to tell how much fertilizer is in the ground. If you got plants nearby, it may be gathering from there. If you got a lawn nearby, it might be getting it from them. So if you want to stay with an organic fertilizer, that's safer than going chemical. Now, they do also recommend that you put gypsum on the ground on a yearly basis. I think Brokaw's website said on their full-grown trees they put 35 pounds of gypsum around each tree every year. I mean, sometimes we'll get a tree like this, and there's a whole handful of white stuff on top of the soil. You say, okay, they put a whole handful of gypsum right there. So gypsum does a couple things. It makes water absorb faster. It allows the sodium salts, which they don't like, to be flushed through. And it, for some reason, helps prevent root rot. They don't know exactly what the mechanism is, but it helps prevent root rot. So we like this fertilizer a lot because it is 8% calcium. There's more calcium in here than any other nutrient. Calcium is needed to make wood of plants, but there's a lot of calcium in that one. There's no calcium listed on this. I'm sure there's a little bit in there. So that's why we like this company. They have all that calcium in that product.
One thing I've noticed is as the winter charlotte is getting bigger, it's going toward the sun. In some cases, growing horizontally, with kind of propping them up a little bit. Otherwise, it would literally be a vine on the ground.
Well, it might produce better that way. So one of the things that they're finding out, a couple things they found out in the last generation, is that fruit trees produce better when they're not allowed to grow too big. So if you have a 20-foot avocado tree, which is typical of the old days, you essentially had a shell of 2 to 3 foot of production around the whole tree, and a huge area in the middle that was not doing a thing because there's no light in there. So they found out that any fruit tree you have, if you keep it only 6 foot across, you got better production per square foot of ground. You'd have to plant, say, 9 trees in the space of one, but those 9 trees in the space of one would be much more productive than the one big tree. So that's the goal of modern orchards, to keep your trees small. Plus, they also, 2 places in the world have always espaliered their avocado. Well, not always, but in Japan they've always done it because they've had to grow them in greenhouses. And what they would do in Japan, and they have them in Quonset huts because it does freeze in Japan. Most of Japan freeze pretty badly. So they would grow them in greenhouses. They'd have their trees in big tubs, and they'd have the branches go up at angles like this, just 2 branches in each one. So you look at this greenhouse, and there's all these branches going to the sides at a slight angle upwards. You need to angle upwards if you want the branch to keep growing. If the branch is horizontal or down, it stops growing. So you got to have the branch slightly pointed up. So they have these things that come out about 15 foot in both directions, and just fruit hanging heavily all along that branch. In South Africa, they've done some orchards with espaliers and said that we're getting better production than we had with standard trees. So I believe this year, University of California, the field station, they're doing that research. They're supposed to put a lot of varieties of avocados on wires to see which one works best with that setup, because that may be the best way to grow avocados. It is one of the current methods they use to grow apples. And the reason for both of those being done that way is the weight of the fruit. So what's going on with avocados is you have this branch that's out here in the sun getting a lot of energy, makes a fruit. The fruit forms, it weighs about 1.25 pounds. Branch does this. It's now ducked out of the sun, never will ever produce again. So the tree's got to grow another branch out here, and then it fruits, and then the same thing happens. All the branches with fruit on them hang into the darkness. So the tree's wasting a lot of energy and having to make new branches. Now, at the Great Park, this was like 7-8 years ago now. 7-8 years ago. We had planted a tree there in 2008, and we went back there 2014, and we just wanted to count the fruit on because it was notably heavy producer. And we noticed there was one branch about 1 foot off the ground, going about 5 foot long, and the fruit on it were touching the dirt. That one branch had 50 avocados. We were counting 50 avocados on a 5 foot long branch. There was more avocados on that one branch than the entire rest of the tree. We're going, that's interesting. Now, looking back at it, knowing what we know now, yeah, that branch couldn't dive into the darkness. It was stuck there. The fruit were on the ground. And then I was at a customer's house that same year. They had a hass tree, one branch on they had the paving stones on the ground, and one branch on it totally loaded. And I was going, God, and I saw it twice that same year. The branch on the ground totally loaded. No place for it to hide. So it was full of sun exposure, totally loaded with fruit. So that's one of the reasons why espaliering might be the wave of the future here, and you can grow them on a fence somewhere.
Well, will avocado grow a fruit spur off of anything?
Anywhere where there's leaves, they potentially can make flowers, yes. Yeah.
Not just on the insect.
True. I mean, the place to get the most sunlight generally flower the most. But boy, we'll talk about Gwen. On our Gwen avocado tree this spring, it seemed to be making flowers at any node on that branch. Any node on each branch was making flowers. Just crazy flowering. Same thing with lamb. Any node on this tree was making flowers. Not all of them set, but boy, we were just seeing incredible blooming on those trees. Well, we had problems this year because no bees. When they were blooming, we couldn't see any bees. I mean, we had a few out. Now, this tree was at our growing ground, and at that growing ground, they have 3 beehives. So this tree was lucky. It was where they had beehives. But here at the nursery, we're looking for bees. We're trying to attract them. And we're spraying honey on the flowers. There's still no bees. We think a lot of bee colonies got killed off this winter by the excessive coolness and excessive water. They said that across the U.S. they lost 48% of all the beehives this last winter, which they said is not unusual. They usually typically lose about 20 to 30% of the beehives every winter due to cold and stuff. This year was a bit higher. They said by mid-year the beekeepers make new beehives, so they're back to normal by this time of year. But this winter might have been a little low for bee activity. So when there's no bees, you can't help it. I mean, you can do these by hand, but That's a lot of work to pollinate them by hand. So pollination-wise, a lot of misinformation there. So we've been told for long periods of time that you need both an A and a B avocado to make fruit. So half a lot of avocados, most avocados that we like, the flower itself, which is small, about 1/4 inch across, and they're kind of a creamy green color. I don't see any open blooms on here right now. What they do is that when they first open, the female part, which is the stigma in the middle, is the main thing. And then half a day later, the male parts stick up and you have the pollen out of the same flower. At that point, the stigma is drying up and it's hard for the pollen to stick to it. So in theory, if you can get fresh pollen to the stigma when it first opens, it's helpful. So the A-type avocados, which are most of the ones we sell, the flowers open in the morning, so it's female in the morning, male in the afternoon. On the B-type avocados, the flowers open in the afternoon. So it's female in the afternoon, male the next morning. So in theory, if you have an A next to a B, you'll get better fruit setting because the pollen will have a better chance of getting to the stigmas. In truth, it's not working that well because the bees don't tend to fly between trees. They tend to go from one flower to the next flower, next flower, next flower, next flower. They don't tend to transfer that well between trees. So the research we've seen has been done on Hass because Hass, we don't sell the original Hass anymore because it only averaged about 100 fruit per tree per year, or 110 fruit per tree per year, which, you know, if you had an apple tree, it'd be like 400 pieces of fruit on the same size tree, or any peach tree, 500 fruit. It's not a particularly heavy producer, so they wanted to do everything they could to promote the production of fruit on Hass, and they found out if they put a Zutano tree, this is not a true Zutano, such as Zutano seedling, but if you got a Zutano tree right close to your Hass, it would produce more fruit. So they said in an orchard, if you have an orchard of Hass, a block of 9 trees, take out the one in the middle and put a Zutano in there. So when they did that, they upped the production of all these trees by 11%. They lost 12% of their orchard because no one buys Zutano avocados. It's a watery Mexican type. So the orchard people said, don't listen. It doesn't help enough. I mean, you know, the researchers said, well, some years it's 15%. Well, stupid, that means some years it's only 5%. It's still not worth it if the average is 11% increase. You could have had another Hass in there and had more good fruit than having that Zutano. Now, if you have a B type that actually is good to eat, then it may be helpful. So nowadays they don't use Zutano anymore. They use different B types that actually can be sold at the supermarket as Hass. So that's the way that went. They said that in avocado trees, when they're big, not all the flowers and all the branches are running the same sequence. Some branches wake up late, some early, so that there seems to be good pollination among the single trees. So
Is there anything to do to get more flowers?
get a better variety. So, well, there is. I mean, more sun exposure, you get more energy stored in that plant. So the more sun exposure you have now, there's something interesting you can do, which is to, get as much energy into these trees in the fall before the spring bloom as you can. Before they make their flower buds in the winter and they bloom in the spring. So we had read in the California Fruit Growers magazine back in the 80s that in the Polyphagous, they're having trouble getting their citrus to bloom up there because it's so cloudy all the time. So one guy started spraying his leaves with sugar water in the fall, and he got it to produce way better. So apparently the leaves on plants absorb sugar, which is what they make from energy. When the sun hits the leaf that's making sugar, the more sugar you store in the branch, the better it blooms. So we did an acid test on it in the 80s. Back in the 80s, I had a plum tree that was, a big, good-sized plum tree making roughly 5 plums per branch. So we took one branch and I sprayed that one branch 6 times that fall, like they said, every 2 weeks. And the next year, that one branch had, instead of having 5 plums per branch, it had over 20. I'm going, okay, that seems to make a difference. So on the plum tree, it worked. I don't know if it'll work as well on an avocado tree, but if you got branches in the shade, you might try that. See if it. It was the original formula was 1 ounce per gallon of molasses. That was the original formula. I've used table sugar. I've used corn syrup. I don't know that it makes a huge difference. We don't like to use molasses as much when I'm spraying other plants because it leaves the residue, that brown, because we would spray our roses with sugar, but if we put molasses in there, all the flowers would turn brown. So, but some form of sugar. And I've talked to other customers about this, and they said, oh, in the Philippines, we always spray our mango trees with cane syrup to make the fruit sweeter. So other people do it too, apparently.
I live about 3 miles from the coast, from the ocean, and I didn't get hardly any flowers this year, and I have not, on all my trees, I don't have any.
Right.
So I felt like this year it was colder.
Yeah, it wasn't a very good year.
I got a few flowers, but
Yeah, the avocado crop this year forecast is pretty low. Not a very good forecast for this year.
You used to recommend pollinator feeding that was 1 ounce of corn syrup or whatever, seaweed and fish oil.
Well, the original formula for that molasses was 1 ounce molasses, 1 ounce fish emulsion, and 1 ounce of seaweed extract per gallon of water.
It stinks, but it seems to help. You still recommend that, or?
Well, if you want just the fruiting, don't add the fish at least, because that's fertilizer. You're gonna make it grow too. Although at that time of year, the November, that's when. So the 2 months they recommend fertilizing avocados before they make the flowers in November, after the fruit sets in June. They said those are the 2 times a year on a Hass orchards where fertilizing actually makes a better crop. Any other time you do it, you're not really helping the fruit set. So they said, November. So if you wanted to do it when you sprayed them with sugar in the fall, that should work. But yeah, this year it just bloomed during rain and cold, so it wasn't a good year for avocados, yes.
what was it because
Winter. So in the old days, when they wouldn't do annual pruning on the avocados and the trees to get up to 25 foot, no one wanted to climb up there and pick fruit anymore. So they would just take a chainsaw and cut them down to 4 feet. So back in the 90s, about 10 years ago, I said, no, it was about 15 years ago. So I got to try this. I got to see if this works. So I had a bacon avocado in my backyard that was about 20 foot, and I just cut it off with my chainsaw to this height. I did that late winter, and it just sat there until early summer, and then it just took off. It grew about 6 foot. And the next year it bloomed and had a crop. I'm going, okay, that didn't stop it very long. I lost the crop actually I picked the fruit off, and then that's when I cut it back. So I didn't really lose. I lost 1 year's crop. I didn't lose the crop. Yeah, it just happened to work for that particular variety because it ripens real early. Most avocados have to hang for a year before you pick them. There's a few that don't hang for quite a year, so you can actually get them in.
How do you know when to pick them?
By the date. Yeah, they don't give any signs that they're ripe. You just start picking. Now you'll know it's at the end of its hang time if the stem right attached to the fruit turns yellow. That little button of stem right before about a few weeks before it drops, it turns yellow. And then you know, okay, there's no more hang time left, might as well pick it at that time. But you can pick avocados really early. Like a couple years ago, we had a Don Gillogly that was due to ripen in April. Well, the wind blew it over on Thanksgiving Day, and some of the fruit fell off. They go, well, what do we do with this? Just throw it away? Well, we just left it on the kitchen counter, and it ripened, and it was actually really good. 5 months early, it was really good. We're amazed it was good that early. Picked the rest of them in April. And, you know, you can't compare, you know, because I couldn't remember in November or December when I ate it, what the difference was by April. But I remember in December when we ate them, they were excellent. So 5 months early, like some avocados like Reed, they say pick July through December. Well, I picked my Reed in January one year, and it was okay. By April, I'm going, well, this is as good as anything I've ever ate. I always finish my Reed trees off before the harvest date that they wrote down. I'm sure it would have been slightly better, but they were so good that I didn't leave them on the tree. So they're usually quite edible well before the perfect date. So, except for bacon's not. Some of the Mexican varieties, you want to leave them on the tree as long as you can. So anyway, so A and B, nice to have both, not essential. Now, as far as sunburn goes, so they can sunburn. A shipment of this stuff is due to arrive in a couple days, so I'm a little low right now. This is organic whitewash. You can use white latex paint, which would not be used in an organic orchard. So this is used in organic orchards. This is limestone mica, milk, silica, diatomaceous earth, iron oxide. So these are all considered organic materials that you can, this is powder in here, and you just mix it with water. You mix the whole can with water, that'll paint about 5 trees. Mix a little bit at a time in a cup of water and just paint the branches that the sun can hit. Again, if the tree's healthy, it won't sunburn until it gets close to 110, or if it's real late or early in the year, like last year. So sunburning is important. Bug-wise, not too many bugs go after avocados. Occasionally we'll get a caterpillar or grasshopper eating the new growth. That's not very common. We do have one pest that's quite common. This is called perseamite. Usually on the bottom of the leaves. If it gets real bad, they'll be on the top also. So there's these silvery patches on this leaf. So perseamites came up from Mexico about 25 years ago. And at that time, there were no natural predators. And what they would do to the trees is they get on the tree would defoliate, curing itself. But that, of course, that messes the tree up for about a half year of no energy or low energy. So we would hit these with oil spray, like this horticultural oil, and one shot would always cure them. One shot of spray you mix this with water, about 4 tablespoons per gallon of water, 3 or 4 tablespoons per gallon of water, spray the entire tree. One good shot would clean up the perseamites. Nowadays, it's not so important. So what the University of California did is went down to Mexico, found a natural predator, which is another mite, that'll eat this mite. So what goes through the neighborhoods now is you get, and the mites not only feed on avocados, they also feed on camphor trees, which are common in Southern California also. So what you see is a wave of this mites going through a neighborhood, and then they're followed by a wave of the predator mites coming up behind them. They all blow around the wind in the air. So that's how they travel from tree to tree by air currents. But each little silvery patch on the bottom leaf is actually a spider web. If you look under there through a strong magnifying glass, you'll see it's a web. And in each little web is a little colony of mites. So they're hard to see with your naked eye, but a good magnifying glass, you can see it. So there can be 1,000 mites on one leaf, sucking on that leaf. And it will, if it gets real bad, again, it shouldn't get bad anymore. We've got the predator mites out there too. Predator mites, if you want to know how to tell them apart, perseamites don't move much. predator mites are like little lions and tigers running around the leaf, and they'll gobble up all the mites they come across. So nature, if you see a little tiny spider mite walking real fast, it's a good guy. So
Spider mites are actually good.
some of them are good and some are bad. Yeah, most spider webs are the webs you see are the regular spiders that eat bugs. These percent mites, the only web they make is that little silvery patch on the leaf. They don't make the bigger webs.
Also, the ends of the leaves are getting maybe short or something. They roll a leaf.
That happens occasionally, yeah. In that case, spray your tree with a product containing spinosad. I have spinosad soap on the shelf there, and that'll take care of any caterpillars and green grasshoppers. If you have brown grasshoppers, good luck. You got to catch them by hand and cut them in half, or have a lot of. Spinosad? It says it can, and it doesn't. I would use the oil. Oil is by far the best thing we've ever seen for spider mites.
So Gary, I have a question. My avocados now have holes. So is that they can't find any bugs or anything? I assume it's grasshopper, either green or brown. Is there no use to see stuff?
Well, if you have a grasshopper, you'll get the cuts coming from the edge. They don't seem to. Yeah. Right in the middle would be more like either a caterpillar or a snail. So snails certainly can climb avocado trees. At the orchard, what they do is they have copper bands on all the trunks. So the snails can't cross that band. I have copper tape over here. I think Orange County Farm Supply actually sells the copper band itself. That lasts longer than the copper tape. So to a caterpillar, it'll kill it. For a snail, it won't.
Or
Rats, I haven't seen them eat avocado leaves, but yeah. Yeah. Well, if you have a small tree, I found a local source that has these gauze mesh bags you can put over a whole tree. Of course, the problem with avocados is they often bloom with the crop on them, so you can't have that bag over when they're blooming. But there are bags you can put over the whole tree to keep anything out of it. But you have to have a small tree for that. Okay, let's see. So root rot, if you get root rot diseases, or if you have a tree and you want to see if you can cure it, the garden foss has been the thing that's been promoted for that. So garden foss, when this first came out in the late 90s, the University of Riverside sent a lot of letters to all the nurseries saying that they've been able to bring avocado trees back from certain death by injecting this into the trunk. Now, we don't sell trunk injectors here. They do sell them at Orange County Farm Supply, but that's kind of an extreme thing to do, is to inject your tree with garden phosphate. Anyway, this is mono and dipotassium salts of phosphorus acid, so it's got 2 fertilizers in it. And apparently the high phosphorus level in the plant's system helps it fight off disease as well. So the EPA in most states labels this as a fertilizer. In California, they label it as a fungicide. Because it is just essentially fertilizers that are being forced into the plant at high doses is to fight off diseases. But we use a lot of this now because it stops fire blight on apple trees, pear trees, loquat trees. It stops a lot of downy diseases on onions, impatiens, roses. There's a lot of things it does well, and it's not a true chemical. I mean, it is a chemical, but it's not what we would consider a normal fungicide that's real toxic, because they don't have any waiting period for this. You apply it, you can eat things, because it's basically a fertilizer.
Yeah, would you use that for stone fruits or wood growers?
No, that's just for diseases.
Okay.
Okay, I think we've. Oh, so there is another pest out there that they were really worried about called a Polyphagous beetle. This came into California, what, 10, 15 years ago? And it's a little weevil that if it finds a tree, it can drill right into the trunk and introduce a fungus that'll kill that part of the tree. And it was going after some avocado, so the industry was really worried about this Polyphagous beetle, which happens to be only about that big. So the beetle drills holes into the trunk of the tree, introduces the fungus because its larvae cannot eat wood, but they can eat the wood that this fungus eats, or they can eat the fungus that is eating the tree. So the beetle brings to it a fungus that kills that part of the tree so its larvae can eat the fungus. It's like we can't eat wood. We can eat mushrooms that eat wood, but we can't eat the wood. So this beetle cannot eat the wood either, but it can eat the fungus that eats the wood. So they were real alarmed. The industry was real alarmed, and then after a year they said, we're not getting any attacks at all. So what's happened is if the tree is being watered adequately, the sap of the tree forces the beetle out of its hole and can't get in there. Now, whenever the beetle drills into the tree, you'll see it because it leaves a little white, looks like little white crystals, a little mound of white crystals forming on the trunk. Because the sap of avocados, when it exudes out, it dries into little white crystals. It looks like, I don't know, it looks weird. It looks almost like a little fungus or something, but it's just white crystals. We saw that back in the 1990s. We told our avocado grower about that, and they said, it's nothing. They analyzed it. They had the Department of Agriculture analyze. They said, there's nothing there. So, but we first noticed that back in, 20 years ago. And we sent samples and pictures to, the agricultural people, and he said, no, it's nothing. So that beetle's been around for a while, but it can't get into healthy trees. So, okay, I think we covered everything. So pruning wise, keep your, if you have to keep your tree smaller, most of the orchards now just do it in the wintertime before it blooms. And generally the tops of the trees, you don't bloom as well anyway. You get best your blooms on the side branches. So a friend who was a current orchard guy, and he says, we don't do the topping down to 4 feet anymore like we used to in the old days. We just trim them every winter, keep them down to picking height, which is less than 10 foot high. So
when you're pruning, you top them, you don't take any branches out much?
well, you just see what the tree gave you and you work with that. I mean, a lot of the trees that we're selling, you don't have to worry about height. You have to worry about the branches not breaking off from the weight of the fruit. So that's the thing with a lot of these new avocados we're growing now. The weight of the fruit is a major problem. Yes.
I'd like to speak to that about 40 years.
Okay.
I was involved in avocados, Haas avocados, and whitewashed them up high every year. We did it with a sprayer. The same crew that worked one orchard worked them all, so everything was standardized. And one thing that was interesting is they would go inside the tree and trim inside the tree to give it more space growing to get some more vertical growth inside. And I'm talking, we had 2015, we had over 300 acres. And everything was standardized. This was all down in this area.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, I had one orchard there that was 50 acres. It was straight across from where Dwarf was. The
Right.
storage and then the trucks that I like. Yeah. Well, all of those are decomposed things. And you go in and jackhammer in. First of all, you go in and you burn everything. There's something else. There's a huge plant that goes wild. So we burn them all. And then go in and take holes in the whole solution and we planted the trees fairly close together, maybe 8 foot apart. And then when we trimmed them, when they were getting bigger, they trimmed them and shaped them in 8 to 9 foot was maximum height.
Okay.
And we'll do that throughout the whole row. And there's just external force to trim so that it will let light come down the
Well, they're ahead of their time if they're keeping that small. Yeah.
yeah, well, it worked. I mean, and for irrigation, we had drip irrigation for the trees. And then we also had injectors on the system for the
Fertilizing. Yeah.
fertilizer.
Okay.
And we did real well for a long time. We also got a fruit ripening business and started that. And then we took it all, you can put almost any type of fruit, bananas or anything down there. Ripen them in a room, large sealed room.
Thank you. Okay. Let's go over the varieties.
Example of how you would trim a tree. I mean, I know that they're all different and they grow different or whatever, but
Well, you know,
some really huge trees and I'm like, I just pull up with a thing and
well, I mean,
narrow.
it's not that important to shape. I mean, if you look at Brokaw's website, some of their avocado trees, about 2 foot off the ground, they're letting them do this. They're just getting multi trunks up there because they want to keep them low. They don't want a single trunk. But the other way to do it is to have a single trunk with horizontal branching. That's how most orchards, they want to see them done, is this way to get maximum fruit production done. But avocados tend to have branches that just keep on hanging down. So, but more low branches you can have, the better. I don't know if, we're still working on.
For width, it's really more talking.
Well, you just want the most sunlight you can get on your tree, but you don't want it to be huge. I mean, we're still working on the way to, I'm sure with the different avocados, there's, some avocados, they're almost vine-like, and they don't make trunks at all. They just hang. And some avocados are very stiff and upright. I mean, there's so many different styles of growth that it's hard to give you one good way to grow it. Some of the avocado trees like Reed tend to want to be a Christmas tree, and that's fine. They're a narrow Christmas tree and it works. So, yeah, so.
Growing up, and then got a little strong branch going off this way, so it went around the house, and now it's gone down. Well, and I have fucking poles trying to pull this branches up, and then it's like, and I'm like, it's maybe 40 or 50 on a good year, so it's worth it. Great fruit, but not a lot. And it's
Right.
so huge. So I could see why.
Are you saying like if it's too far out, it's not getting in the sun, just go ahead and trim those? So you just want to make sure, did you mention like certain width, right?
Well, the smaller you can keep a tree down to about 6 feet wide, the more fruit you're going to get on the branches. But there's no rules here. If you want like in my backyard, I want my tree to be a shade tree, so we're going to let it grow to about 10 foot, 15 foot high, and maybe 20 foot across, because it's not being used for fruit production as much as it is for shade. So
Fruit production just shows out where the sun's hitting.
yeah, and the more stuff that gets hit by the light, the more fruit you can get. Whether or not you thin out the interior to make the sun go in. We've seen on trees where where the tree from above would just be a round thing. So what the managers do is they start lobing it. So they'll cut out branches to get more exposure to the sunlight. Instead of just being a round ball, now it's lobed into many sections, so the sun has more places to get into the center of that tree. But it's like every tree grows so differently that you can't make any general rules for how to train them. That's why University of California is going to be espaliering avocados, just see if that works real well for them. If you can get 50 avocados in each branch, each layer on this espalier, it's like, okay, you get 150 avocados, which is the whole tree's worth, on a little fence line. So that'd be interesting if they can do it.
Sounds almost like you're worried about overpruning it, and I don't think you can overprune an avocado.
Well, you waste energy, but
Cut it down to 4 foot.
yeah, you can.
Right.
Generally, if you don't cut it past the last leaf on the branch, that branch can still bloom the next year. So.
I've always heard that topping trees is really bad for them, but since this grows more like a vine-like, is that why?
Well, topping trees cause a lot of damage. So if you do it a lot often, you're gonna that shortens the life of the tree. But versus having a 50-foot avocado tree, you might as well top it. So.
For commercial growth, you don't want it over 10 foot. I can seriously want 9 feet.
Yeah, especially if you're on a hill. There's no way you're gonna.
You've got stickers for what we need. They're trying to put the community as possible. And they got large bags. Around the net. And there'll be a box with very soon see something.
Okay.
They're looking at the
Okay, the original avocado grown in California commercially was Fuerte back around 1900. It survived a really nasty frost, which we seem to get about every 30, 40 years, a really nasty frost. So don't forget about it. We'll probably, in 1990, is actually, though, the coldest temperatures ever recorded in California was 1990, December 1990, during the height of global warming, in fact. So. We hit 23 degrees throughout most of Orange County 2 days in a row that year, and a lot of the young avocado trees froze to the ground. So that was a nasty year. Fuerte survived one in 1900. I don't know if they had many temperature recordings back at that time. So Fuerte was the first one commercially grown in California, but according to one of our textbooks written about 40 years ago, Fuerte avocado trees, in a Fuerte avocado orchard, 80% of the trees do nothing. 20% of them make the entire crop. And they don't know why that happens. They don't know how to solve it. So they don't recommend Fuertes at all anymore for orchard purposes. Now, some of the trees produce like crazy. You just can't predict which one it's going to be. Because when I was growing up, my dad had two. One fruited heavily, one never made a fruit. And we hear that with customers all the time. Our Fuerte tree is great. And from other people, our Fuerte tree never makes anything. And nobody knows exactly why that happens. So we don't really recommend it. Now, Fuerte is considered one of the top 5 tasting avocados ever. So we still offer, because people want that top 5 avocado. Just good luck on it. So when Hass came out, the Hass Ranch in, what was it, Yorba Linda? And his name is Hass. Brokaw, who was their neighbor, told me it's not Haas, it's Hass. Haas would be H-A-A-S, it's Hass. So they were trying to grow Fuertes, and one of their grafts didn't take, and the tree that grew Hass fruit. And it was a heavier producer than Fuerte, so they went with that one. So that slowly became, in fact, I heard that was the first fruit tree ever patented. The problem with plant patents is that the person who placed the patent has to police it. And Haas said when he was older, he says, I couldn't turn my fellow farmers to the police. They were just all grafting their own trees, and I wasn't getting any residuals, but I just didn't want to turn them into the police. So, you know, what do you do? So, but that was supposed to be the first patent ever. But Haas has never been a great producer, better than Fuerte, but the average on each tree is only 110 fruit per year. They said that, you know, every so often they make a huge crop, but when you average it out, it's about 110 fruit per tree per year. So they've been taking offspring of Haas. The first offspring that was heavy was called, they don't grow it anymore, but it was, I think it was Thiels. I don't know if that's spelled right. And they said, okay, we'll take seedlings of this and see what we get. And out of that batch, the heavy one was Gwen. Haas is an A-type, Gwen's an A-type. So Gwen is the super producing avocado found in the 80s. They started selling it to the farms in the 90s. It's a granddaughter of Haas. Crazy production. So the Gwen on its second year, which is the same age as this, would average 54 fruit per tree. Whereas the Haas typically would make 0, a Fuerte would make 0. This Gwen was averaging 54 fruit its first year, 144 its second, which is just crazy productions. But the orchards came back, and after about 5-6 years said, we can't grow this thing. We can't thin it out. It just, all the branches keep breaking off the tree every summer. They just keep breaking apart. So the university started growing seedlings of Gwen that were not quite so productive. So they've been coming out now. Lamb, also known as Lamb Haas, is one of them. Gem, Harvest, which we don't carry. And the newest one just released by University of Riverside is Luna, which was called Marvel until Disney told them you can't use that name on an avocado. So they had to change it to Luna. But these are all seedlings of Gwen. And they've chosen these because they look a little more like Haas. Like Gwen, they said, doesn't darken up like Haas does as well. So customers are getting confused a bit. But these all, well, Gem doesn't either, but Luna does darken up like a Haas does. Lamb does a pretty good job too. So they're going with, but most orchards right now are going either Lamb, Gem, and next year they'll be ordering the Lunas for the orchard. Now, when they put patents on these, we can't touch them for homeowners for 20 years. So it'll be, boy, I'll be really old by the time Luna's released. Now, there's always ways to get trees. If you called up Brokaw and you ordered 20 Lunas, you can get them. Because their minimum order for an orchard is 20. So if you order 20, well, order 40 Lunas, sell us the rest. But Gem is certainly a really good avocado. Lamb, so you can see this lamb here, is certainly a really good avocado producer. Now, we're growing a Gwen out in front in a box, and we wanted to see how well it's set. And boy, it's a crazy bloomer. Let's put it that way. So it may not set better than Haas, but it makes way more flowers than a Haas tree ever would. I mean, every single joint on this tree, even without a leaf attached, was making flowers this year. Like every square inch of those branches were blooming. It was just crazy blooming. And we saw hundreds of fruit on there early this year. Most of them had dropped off. We're now probably a little lower than 100, maybe down to 70 or so. So it's supposed to make 54 on average. I mean, you know, they take an average of them. So we'll see how many it ends up with. It's a little hidden back there, so it's not getting as good sunlight. This was getting in full sunlight. That one's not getting quite so good. So we'll be happy if we get over, say, 40 on there. But we're wanting to see how well that does. So all these, a friend of mine has gems at her orchard down the road. I think she planted them 4 years ago, and this year on one of her trees, she got 250 marketable fruit off her gem, and it was about 8 foot tall and maybe 8 foot wide. It wasn't real full yet. It wasn't a ball. It was kind of irregular shaped within those things, and she was amazed because she says she never gets that much fruit off of any other avocado tree in her orchard. And that wasn't all it made. She says there was about 50 that they couldn't sell because the squirrels had nicked them. So, but excellent fruit, real, you know. So if you go to a store, you're buying, you're buying Hass, you're buying Gwyn's, you're buying Lamb's gems. I don't know if you're buying Harvest. There's a couple others that they sell at the market. One is Carmen, which we also were promoting heavily for a while. So Carmen's a sport of Hass, not a seedling, it's a sport. So down in Mexico, Carlos Mendez, who this is named after, found in one of his Hass orchards a tree that flowered repeatedly over the year. Now they had seen this on some trees in the past, but they'd never been able to replicate it. So when they're taking cuttings of this Carmen tree to make new trees, all the offspring did the same thing. They would bloom repeatedly over the year, but we never know what a Carmen's going to do. So down in Mexico, they said their Carmen trees are doing about 27 tons of avocados per acre. The average in California is 7 on Hass orchards. Hass averages 7, Carmen's averaging 27. But again, down in Mexico, 80 degrees, 90 degrees in the wintertime, you can't beat that. Now, what Carmen was doing in Mexico, so all the Mexican orchards are converting to Carmen because Carmen, the big bloom of the year for Carmen is not the spring bloom, it's the fall bloom in October, November. They said all those avocados are perfectly timed for Super Bowl Sunday. And that's their market. So they are all transplanting, now on Carmen's here, the fall bloom is almost nil because it's getting too cold here. 40 degrees at night doesn't work anymore for that. So Carmen's here, but they're unpredictable. So, if you have an orchard of Carmen trees, what people have these orchards tell us is you can walk in those Carmen orchards any day you want and find a tree with ripe fruit. It's not particularly one tree, because at my house, the tree I planted in my backyard is a Carmen. We had it in a box for about 6 years. One year we saw it bloom 4 times, 4 seasons. Every time it's bloomed, it made a crop, small crop. Then some years it doesn't bloom at all. Some years it blooms in the summer. Some years it doesn't bloom, has a winter bloom, and it doesn't have regular spring bloom. We never know what's going to do. So it does its own thing. But if you have an orchard full of Carmens, you can go in there any day you want and pick fruit. But if you only have one Carmen, you don't know what you're going to get. But you can get fruit year round. I mean, we planted one at the Great Park, and they told us they can pick fruit any time they want off that one tree. But a friend of mine who has a similar one at their house, they said, no, they can't do that. So we're going with some of these heavier producers instead. The Carmen, they've been comparing it to gem for about the last 5 years production-wise, and the gem with its one big bloom a year seems to be right about the same as Carmen with its several blooms per year. And we think as time goes on, we think the gem's going to be better than the Carmens, because the fruit set on them is so much heavier on that spring bloom. But we'll still keep the Carmens around because it's still interesting and nice to have more than one bloom year. Like this year, if it blooms again in summer, that might make a far better crop than the spring bloom, because spring was during lousy weather conditions. In fact, one of the people that works at Broco told me that at their orchard, that saved them that year, because that year was 2008, I believe, was such a cold winter and spring. They said they blanked on their Hass trees, but their Carmens bloomed that summer and saved their hide for the next year. So these are the Hass types. Now there's another one, Surprise, which is also related. And Surprise is good because it is a B. I believe Luna's a B. These are A's. Lamb, I don't recall. What does it say? A. Thank you. Harvest, I don't know. So that at her orchard down this road, she did gem and surprise. 8 gems and 3 surprise in amongst the trees there, the other trees. So that's the one they use. Surprise ripens a little before gem does. So it's nice to have that too. So you can pick this one first, this one next. About the same time as Hass and gem. Lamb is late. So lamb you can leave on the tree far longer, all the way into winter. So most of gem and surprise, late winter through spring into summer, well, into June or so. And then the lamb you pick up in summer, and you can hang on the tree until all the way through fall. Fuerte's late winter into spring. I think that's all the ones that are related to Hess that we. Oh, so there's another one. So another seedling of Hass is Don Gillogly, which Mr. Don Gillogly planted a Hass pit in his home in La Jolla many, many decades ago. And up comes this tree that looks nothing like Hass, tastes really good. So the fruit on this one have a long neck and a small base. Dark skin at the bottom, lighter skin at the top. Ripens. So we have one customer who's been growing this tree for 20 years. He says he gets a distinct crop in April, another crop in August. So it's nice that way. It has double crops, 2 distinct ripening periods. It is really good at those peak moments. The skin's a little bit thin on it, and it does have a tendency for this to ripen before this. So the bottom ripens before the neck does. But when we first ate that, we go, oh, this is really good. So it is one of the, last year was our top seller because we had the tree out there with fruit hanging on it. And it made 25 its first year, for a second season, second year of life, it made 25 fruit. So that was pretty neat. So it's still considered a heavy producer. So the heavy producers tend to be small. Gwen, when they introduced it in 1990, was considered a dwarf tree, but University of California had suspicions about what it would do. If they're letting it fruit, it rarely got any taller than this because the fruit was just weighting it down so heavily. But they said what they did is they took 5 of their gems, cut off all the flowers for 5 years. All 5 trees broke 20 foot. So without the fruit production, they'll grow as fast as a Hass, 3 foot a year till they break. You know, most avocados grow 3 foot, 4 foot a year, and until they get above 20 foot. So if you don't let this thing fruit, it grows. But if you allow it to do its thing, it's small. And same with most of these. All heavy producers, if you let them fruit, they're not growing. In fact, you may have to thin them out just to keep the branches. You know, at the orchard last year, she had all these stakes on all our trees to keep those branches from laying on the ground. So.
In your list, you call it one a delicate tree. What do you think about that?
That's been said about it, and that it produces so heavily that it's too heavy for its own good. And they said it's not quite as winter cold hardy as the Hass is. So it's still, I don't know. That's why we're growing one. We want to see what that means. So far, the tree looks fine, the ones we have here. But we haven't had a severely cold winter. We had a cool winter, but not a cold one. So, okay, so these, I don't think there's any more Hass offspring here. Actually, Esther may be a Hass offspring too. So Esther is another super producer. University of California never promoted it for orchard use because even though they said the fruit is normally excellent, they had 1 year in their testing where the fruit turned out really bad and they don't know why. So just in case they didn't want the orchard to suffer any bad years, they withheld that from the orchards. but they said normally the fruit is really good on this tree. We have an Esther right in the middle of our, next to our display there with fruit on it too. Esther is supposed to make around 40 fruit its second year. Ours has less only because we've been knocking it off. Every time we walk by it, we knock some of the fruit off of it. So Esther's another one of the Hass offspring. Guess that's it. Now Forte was taken all around the world when we first started going in here. They took it to Israel too. Israel didn't think it produced well enough, so Israel took a seedling of Forte called Etzinger, which is a much heavier producer than Forte. Not quite as good at fruit, but still really good. And Etzinger is, we've seen it produce. It's a really good producer also. This is all on your chart, so you don't really have to write that down. I haven't eaten it. We've seen it make fruit, and then people buy the trees from us. I haven't isolated one yet to test the fruit, but it's supposed to be similar. It's Etzinger 9 to 20 ounces, Forte 9 to 16, so it might be a little bit bigger. Okay, then we got a lot of oddball fruit avocados. So most avocados, like Don and Gillogly, someone plants a pit and they get something wonderful. Now, I have one customer who told me they planted 13 Hass pits and they eat fruit off of 8 of them. They said 5 of them aren't very good. So that's kind of what you'll see. Now, what the University of California does is they just plant a whole bunch of pits off the tree that they want to get the offspring off of and see what they get. So I was told back in the 80s that they had planted like 300 Hass pits or 300 avocado pits and grew the trees and evaluated each one. That's how they got a hold of Gwen and Witzel and that first round of them. Esther, I think, came from that group, and then they took Gwen and started getting the offspring from Gwen to make the modern avocados we use that they're planting right now. So there's Bacon. The gentleman who named that tree is Jim Bacon. So there's one avocado out there called Jim, another avocado tree called Bacon. Those are both his. I guess he's very proud of his work. But Bacon is a B-type avocado. It's almost true Mexican. It ripens early. So the book used to say November through January. I'll tell you that if you pick it in November, it tastes like water. If you pick it in January, it's good. It's good. The oil content's not super high, 18%, which is really the same as Hass. But I swear at the very end of its harvest period, it tastes a bit like bacon. So anyway, so it's a good producer, not huge tree that ripens really early. An Adrenal. Now, we grew this one in a box a couple years ago, and we got some fruit that were pretty good size, maybe about like that. They were big. The book says they're not that big, but our tree had 4 on it. They were absolutely huge. It could have just been because there's only 4. Adrenal, to us, has been very, very vigorous. Big leaves, big stems, everything on it's big. It's like it's going to be a big tree. The book says it's small. No, it says it's tall. Tall, slender. Okay. Well, I see different things on different websites. It depends which website you look at. Sometimes the University of California differs from the websites of some of their employees. Well, their own researchers has their own website with different opinions than the official website. So it depends who you're talking to. But Adrenal, everything about it, the leaves are big, the stems are thick, really vigorous. Looks really good. I mean, our tree after 1 year, at the end of the year when we started from one of these liners, was 7 foot, maybe 8 foot tall. We were really impressed by what it did that 1 year. We had it in the box by the end of that year, in fact. And then it made 4 fruit that next year. And then the following year it said about 20 or 30, and it's now in someone's yard. And they were a good fruit. Then there's Holiday. So Holiday is the shortest avocado known. It's shorter than the one called Wirtz and a lot better tasting. The one called Wirtz or Little Cotto. Holiday is even shorter, and we can see why. When we first get the liners, the leaves look like regular leaves, but as the tree grows, the leaves get skinnier and longer and skinnier and smaller. And the tree looks like it turns into a vine, so it's got vine-like growth. So there's no way this Holiday can ever grow upwards because it's growing it just falls over off the stake. So it's a really small tree. It got a bad reputation because the University of California licensed it to the 2 nurseries that grow lousy trees. So everybody was buying Holidays and they were rotting right out. Buying Holidays and rotting right out. So it got a bad reputation of being a hard one to grow. No, it's easy, just like any other avocado tree. As long as they're not in compost, they're fine. Holiday makes really big fruit July through November. Now, this has to be on the tree for a year and 3 months before you pick it. So, by the end of the first year, the fruit's maybe this big. And then by the next summer, then it gets a little bit larger, and that's when you pick it. So a lot of these trees that have fruit in the fall are fruit that's been hanging on the tree over a year. So Holiday makes these fruit that are slightly pear-shaped, big fruit. To me, they always tasted like very firm salted butter. A little different tasting than other avocados I've eaten, but